So thank you very much for joining us today. It's really, really exciting to have the chance to talk to you about bogong moths and what we're doing about them and Pollinator Week and all these wonderful, exciting things that are going
The
on
couch running?
out in the world. Um, and I'd like to, of course, start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today, which is the Darug and the Gundungurra people of what's now known as the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney, which is a beautiful place, which holds lots of amazing history and also, of course, a lot of both positive history, but also quite dark history in terms of the European settlements around this area. So my name is Kate Umbers. I am an associate professor at Western Sydney University. I'm also the managing director of Invertebrates Australia, which is a conservation organisation that aims to look after the little creatures that run the world. And we're going to talk about quite a few of those today. I'm also a counsellor on the Biodiversity Council, which is an organisation that does a lot of advocacy work to make sure that we are looking after our environment and all of our biodiversity. So today we are talking about the Species Challenge, of course, the Species Conservation Challenge by our Ludo, which is in its final stages. And so this is one of your last chances to get involved. And I'm going to talk to you a lot about how you can include bogong moths in this challenge. So this is totally free and it's linked to the curriculum. So it's a really neat way to engage in real science and real conservation work that's happening in Australia. And what we're hoping for is that you're going to all come up with amazing creative solutions as to how we can look after our little invertebrates, how we can make sure that we are giving credit to these little tiny creatures that often get overlooked, but are actually super duper important and extremely cool. So if you haven't registered for the challenge yet, jump on in. And yeah, we'd love to get everybody involved and working with these really important little critters. So before I talk a little bit about bogong moths, I wanted to introduce myself a little bit more fully. And how I kind of came to be working on the conservation of invertebrates. So I was born and raised in Sydney on Darug country, not too far away from where I'm living now. And I spent my childhood kind of backing onto like a little scrap of bushland in the Sydney suburbs in northwestern Sydney. And I used to visit my grandparents' farm when I was a kid, and pretty much every school holidays down on the south coast of New South Wales and Ewan country. And that was the greatest. It was like endless adventures. We would go to, to Tarthra Wharf and these kinds of places and visit these beautiful wild places. And it was it had made a big impression on me, I think, as a small person. But I wasn't the kind of characteristic kind of bug kid. I wasn't sort of bringing things in and keeping them all in my bedroom. I was actually really a sporty kid. I played lots and lots and lots of netball, and I represented the state in all kinds of things. Got distracted from high school because of sport, and yeah, came to bugs and conservation a little bit later on. For my HSC, I did biology and drama and art and all kinds of different things. So I don't have that classic kind of story of I was always going to be, the kind of the animal person. But it's so it's worth knowing that you never quite know where you might end up, and we have a lot of different things in our personalities. I didn't do all that well at high school. I was too busy having fun and playing sport and things like that. So I ended up going to university actually to study a Bachelor of Policing. So I was going to do some criminology for a while there. But I decided that I wasn't really interested in it. And I thought to myself, what's the coolest job in the whole world? Because that's what I want to do. I want to try to do the coolest job. And the coolest job I could possibly think of was to become a marine biologist, which, is pretty standard for a lot of people. And I decided to go for it. And it was pretty scary, actually, because I hadn't done, much chemistry or physics or any of that stuff in high school. And it was, yeah, it was a big shift in where I'd come from. But I'd found my home. When I started studying biology at university, I felt like I'd come home. So it was a really wonderful experience, but wanted to share that with you just to make it clear that everybody's career paths are very wide ranging and can be very unpredictable. And I started working at Ocean World at Manly and all those sorts of things and feeding sharks. This is the picture of me feeding sharks at Ocean World. And yeah, and I sort of never looked back once I found that. So once I did my Bachelor of Marine Science at uni, I stayed on and to do research, to do PhDs and things like that. And I was the first person in my family to get a PhD, followed closely by my cousin, Dr. Umbers, the junior at UWA. But I didn't do it in marine science. So during my undergraduate, what I realized is, and I know many people in my cohort can relate to this, is I realized that actually the place where all the really cool discoveries is in the bugs, because they're just doing everything and anything you can imagine. Whereas your old koalas and cassowaries and all those guys have all got roughly the same number of eyes and legs and all that sort of stuff. Bugs can be doing anything. They can have any number of eyes, any number of legs. They can be doing wild and crazy things with their life cycles. So it was so exciting and so interesting that I couldn't help but follow down this invertebrate path. And the reason I ended up working on insects is actually because one of the lecturers at the university said, "Hey, Kate, I'd really like it if you'd join my lab and work with me on a research project." And I'd learned enough in my life by that stage to realize that it's a really good idea to work with people that want to work with you. And that worked out really well for me. I got an amazing supervisor, was working in a great research lab, and I ended up choosing to work in the snowy mountains. So this is a picture of the spring melt. So probably what it would look like down there around about now, because we've had so much snow this year. So the snow kind of, sort of melting away up just above Thredbo, for those of you who'd been down that way. I just thought that the Snowy Mountains was one of the most exciting and wild places in Australia, and I wanted to go and explore it. So during my PhD studies, I packed my suitcase and went off to explore what lives down in the Snowy Mountains. What cool things could I find to work on? And I found amazing critters that live nowhere else. So I found like this thermocolored grasshopper that changes color depending on the temperature. These amazing mountain katydids who flash their brightly colored undies when they are scared by predators and run away, looking like a little superhero with a cape on. Totally cool stuff. But as I was working down there, I started wondering to myself, what is going on with the bogong moths? What is happening with those critters? I remember growing up in Sydney and my dad telling me stories of these amazing moths that come to your light and then they fly thousands of kilometers down to the mountains, and no one knows much about what they do down there. So we're going to talk about the bogong moths next, but I wanted to pause for questions about what I've talked about so far, in case anybody wants to jump in. So if you can send them into the chat, the Ludo Q&A, then Erin, who's running everything in the background, she can see them. She can send them through to me. So if you have any questions, generally about me, before we move on to the rest of the talk, I'm very happy to answer them. Not seeing anything coming through yet, but I'm guessing that's okay. So I think we can move on. All right. So where am I? Okay. So today what we want to think about is how awesome invertebrates are. That's just the most important thing I want you to take home with you from this talk, is that they're really, really awesome. They're interesting and they're beautiful, and um, and we hear a lot of other kinds of stories about invertebrates, but in Invertebrates Australia, our job is really to try to remind everybody just how cool and beautiful and wonderful these creatures are, and how much they actually make us happy when we find them in our gardens and at the beach, in rock pools, and all those sorts of things. So when I'm talking about invertebrates, I'm talking about actually almost all animals. There's 35 main groups of animals, and invertebrates are in all of them. There's only one small group that has vertebrates in it, but all 35 groups of animals, main groups of animals, are invertebrates. So here we have spiders and crabs and wasps and bees and snails and sea stars and corals. These are all different types of invertebrates, and all of them are animals. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about invertebrates. We're really talking about the vast, vast, vast majority of all animals. And they're really important for maintaining healthy country, be that through eating mosquitoes, being food for other animals, decomposing waste, composting the forest, you name it, they do it. And of course, what we're thinking about today is the pollination that they get up to. So there's a little flower here with lots of little moths sitting on it. I think it looks like a billy button, which is something you'd find in the mountains too. And you can see that they're all feeding on little bits of nectar and probably getting covered in pollen. There's also a bit of a sad story here in Australia. We have almost 1,000 threatened invertebrates. That means that about 1,000 of our invertebrate species are threatened with extinction. So here's just a tiny little fraction of those, some really beautiful ones. So Sarah's peacock spider, giant clam, giant velvet worms, crayfish, dinosaur ants. There's so many cool ones. And Invertebrates Australia, our whole aim is to look after these critters, and the point of your conservation challenge is really to help us, come up with really cool ideas, and see if you can create a cool idea that maybe somebody in your neighborhood or in your local council might be interested in doing. So pollinators are super important. Most people have heard of pollinators these days, but possibly you don't know about which pollinators are the most important in terms of moving pollen around. So we often think about bees, and certainly bees are important pollinators, but there's a lot of other really cool ones. So hoverflies, which sometimes look like bees, like this creature down in the bottom left of my screen, but also the one on the right, which is covered in pollen. Hoverflies are super important because not only do they pollinate, move pollen around from flower to flower, but they also eat little pest species too. So they sort of are a bit of a win-win, those guys. But we've got lots of things, lots of invertebrates that pollinate, and it's important to remember that it's not only bees. And the reason we're talking about pollinators, of course, is because it's Pollinator Week this week. So why do we have a Pollinator Week? Well, we have a Pollinator Week really to raise awareness about pollinators. Every November we have Pollinator Week, and we talk about not only invertebrate predators but also vertebrate predators, like bats and all of those really groovy critters too. And to remind people that it's important to look after these wonderful creatures because they are really cool in their own right and also doing a really important job. So what then about Bogong moths? So Bogong moths are a very famous Australian insect that fly. Well, we don't actually know how far they fly. They fly a long way across Australia. One of the things my research lab is trying to find out at the moment is exactly how far they fly. But we know, for example, that they come from Brisbane to the Snowy Mountains. They might even fly all the way from Perth over to the Snowy Mountains. And we think that they do that because they get too hot where they are, where they're born as little caterpillars down in the low country. Now, to fly that far, you need a lot of fuel. You need a lot of nectar. And when you drink nectar from flowers, when you're visiting flowers along the way across the country, you get covered in pollen. And so one of the questions that we have around bogong moths is, how important are they for pollination? So if I take a couple of steps back, one of the reasons we're talking about bogong moths today is that they are listed as threatened. They're listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List. And that's because they're mountain caves that they use to avoid the heat. So they fly up from the lowlands into the mountains, and then they hang out all summer in those cool mountain caves. Those mountain caves are getting hot. With climate change, they're getting hot. And so the bogong moths are threatened because this really important cold area that they need is heating up. And this listing of their endangered status made us focus more on what's actually going on with these bogong moths. What is happening with them, and are they okay? So like I said, we think that we know they're flying a long way. We don't know exactly how far they're flying, but when they're flying along, they are fueling as they go. So they're visiting, in this case, there's a picture of a bogong moth sitting on a bottle brush and drinking the nectar. And just in Canberra in the last couple of months, people have seen them all over eucalypt flowers, drinking away as they're heading up into the mountains. So pretty cool. Are they pollinating as they go? So I've got a little video to show you. I'll see if I can bring it up for you. Oh, there it goes. So this is so let me just start that again. When bogong moths reach the top of the mountains, they hide in all these cracks and crevices and all these little cold places. And every evening at sunset, they fly out. Thousands of them fly out all around the top of Mount Kosciuszko. And here's a video of what it looks like at sunset when the moths are flying out at the top of Mount Kosciuszko. So this is looking kind of southwest from the top, just almost at the very top of Mount Kosciuszko, which is the highest peak in Australia, down in southern New South Wales. So you can see all the little black dots all over the place here. There's thousands and thousands of moths flying all around these people. It's a really spectacular thing to see. So they fly, they visit flowers on the way up, and they also visit flowers in the mountains. It's probably not a coincidence that they arrive in the mountains right when all the flowers bloom, all the beautiful alpine flowers. And some first studies have shown that actually bogong moths, there's more bogong moths than there are any other kind of moths in the mountains. And they carry more kinds of pollen on them than any other moth in the mountains. So it seems like bogong moths are a really important pollen carrier and that they're visiting lots of flowers. But to actually show that they are pollinating, we need to take another step, which hasn't been taken yet, which is around showing that the pollen they actually carry fertilizes the flower of the plant that they visit, and that turns into a fruit. And that's a step that scientists haven't made yet. So what we say at the moment is that they're pollen carriers and they are flower visitors, but whether or not they're true pollinators remains to be seen. So what's the big deal? Well, bogong moths spectacularly crashed. So their mountain habitats are getting very hot, but also their numbers spectacularly crashed in around 2017, 18, and 19. And this is a huge worry. When we walked into caves that were normally full of moths on the top of Mount Kosciuszko, we found none. Where there would normally be tens of thousands of moths, there were none. And subsequently, the numbers have crept back up to around about half of the pre-crash numbers. But when that happened, we realized we actually don't know what's going on outside of the mountains. So what we're really interested in figuring out is where are they breeding and what routes are they taking to the mountains to make sure that we look after the bogong moth across their entire range. So what should we do to help the bogong moth? So first of all, we need to be fighting the climate crisis because we know that they need cold mountains, and we know that global warming is causing the mountains to heat up. We need to figure out, where do they breed? We don't know where they're coming from, and we don't really know the routes they're taking to get to the mountains. But if we could figure that out, then we could help mitigate, we could help make it more likely that they're going to survive these higher mountain temperatures by ensuring that they have what they need on their way to the mountains and where they're breeding. We need to know what plants that they visit on their way. We know at least one visits a callistemon, so that's something. And then once we know what they need and the places they use, we need to restore and look after those places. So in my research lab, we're doing lots of things. We're trying to use something called stable isotopes, which is a chemistry technique to understand where adult moths spent their days as caterpillars. We're using genetic techniques to understand how they're sharing genes, how they're breeding with each other around the country. We're looking at the pollen that the moths carry on them on their bodies, and to figure out which plants they've been visiting and where those plants were. We're also looking at newspaper records and collecting people's stories around what they remember about bogong moths to try to understand where important places for bogong moths were in the past. And we are doing something that's hasn't been done before in Australia, where we're tagging bogong moths with tiny, tiny, tiny little pieces of paper with numbers on them. And we're going to try to do 10,000 moths in February next year on the top of Mount Kosciuszko, release them, and hope that people see them across the country and can tell us where these moths have flown to, so that we can get the first ever data on where bogong moths fly when they leave the mountains. We've got lots of things that people can do to help. So that is record observations. If you see a little brown moth, you think it might be a bogong moth, take a photo, put it on iNaturalist or put it on Moth Tracker. Look out for our tagged moths in autumn of 2026. And tell us your stories. If you remember bogong moths, if your parents tell you a story about bogong moths, even little things, even little tiny anecdotes, like you remember when you're at a barbecue one night and there was lots flying around and it was such and such's 40th birthday, or whatever the memory might be. These are all really, really useful and can be really important in our understanding of reconstructing the past bogong moths. So to participate, to keep on top of what's happening with bogong moth conservation and all of those things, you can go to bogong.org, you can sign up to the newsletter, and you can stay in contact. So I'm really happy to answer any questions you have about bogong moths before we move on to the last part of our talk. Okay, so I can see a few questions that have come through the talk, so let me grab a few of those. So my favorite place in Australia to look for invertebrates. It's a great question. Gosh, a few things come to mind. First of all, my garden. I love going out in the morning, before I go take my kids to school and all of those things, and just have a look for some moths, some critters, some little butterflies or things sitting on flowers. We also have a bug lantern on our front veranda that we switch on every now and then, and we love going through all the things that the bug lantern has caught overnight to see what moths have been in our backyard overnight, and then let them all go in the morning. That's super, super fun. I recommend every family gets a bug lantern. My other favorite place is to go to the most tropical place I can find. And because, places like far north Queensland or Borneo or the Amazon rainforest, these places have oodles and bedoodles of amazing bugs that you couldn't possibly even imagine. So those are probably my two favorite places in the world. And I guess my garden is my favorite place in Australia. My favorite invertebrate, I just can't even answer it. There's possibly 10 million invertebrate species in the world, but I do really enjoy working on the bogong moths at the moment. My favorite invertebrate I've studied, I think the silliest invertebrate I've studied is the mountain katydid, the one that flashes its colorful undies when it gets scared by predators. And that's because it only does that after it's been attacked, which is just the silliest thing, because you would think that maybe you should do that before you get attacked. But the mountain katydid waits until after it's been pecked by a bird, and then it flashes its colors, and then the bird goes, oh, this thing is bad tasting, I shouldn't eat it. But it just doesn't make much sense. And so I really enjoyed working on that critter. Why did I think the marine biologist would be the coolest job? I don't know. I don't know why I thought it would be the coolest. Something about working with animals and working in big wild places that I found really appealing. What course can you do to become a bug scientist? So any science usually requires an undergraduate degree. So you would go to university and do a Bachelor of Science and take any units at all that you could that would get you more information about invertebrates. But you can also choose to study invertebrates after you've completed your Bachelor of Science or whatever the case may be. You can also work at a zoo, you can work at a conservation organization. There's lots of different avenues for being a bug scientist, and of course, government jobs too. How small is the paper tag on the bogong moth? Great question. It is 6 millimeters in diameter. So it is basically identical to the little piece of paper that comes out of the hole punch. When you punch a hole, it's about 6 millimeters in diameter, that little tiny circle of paper. How large do bogong moths get? Bogong moths are much smaller than you might think. Bogong moths get to about 3 centimeters long, maybe about as long as 2/3 of your thumb, and they weigh about between 200 milligrams and 400 milligrams, which is about 0.2 of a gram to 0.4 of a gram. So quite small, actually. They have a reputation for being really large, but perhaps that's just because there's lots of them. We don't know how long bogong moths live for, but we think if they do fly from their breeding grounds, go up into the mountains, and then go all the way back to their breeding grounds in the western and northern and possibly far western areas of Australia, then they must live for about 10 months, which is a very long life for a moth. But it's also possible that they do this migration over multiple generations. How do we attach the tag without hurting them? It's very easy. We give the wings a little gentle rub with a cotton tip, and then we use, actually what we use is eyelash glue, a little tiny dab of eyelash glue, and then very gently stick the little paper tag onto their wing with a little pair of forceps. So it's very, very soft and gentle. And we sometimes cool them down a little bit in a little cold container to make them a little bit sleepy, to make sure that they don't stress out while we're doing it. Why do the moths migrate? It's a fantastic question. Everybody thinks that it's because they get far too hot in the low country where they're born, and that triggers them to leave and to find colder areas. And that's because they have an incredibly low preferred body temperature. They prefer only, they get too hot to kind of function normally at only about 32 degrees, which is much, much cooler than most insects. We don't know what flower the moths like the most, but hopefully we'll find out the answer to that question. I've been with Invertebrates Australia for 4 years because I am one of the founding directors of Invertebrates Australia, and so I've been from Invertebrates Australia. I've been at Invertebrates Australia for the whole time that Invertebrates Australia has existed. Oh, and then one final question is, how many moths should be in the caves together? So in the past, the expected number of moths was about 4 billion, which is the equivalent of about 6 million caramello koalas landing on the top of Mount Kosciuszko in terms of the amount of energy that those moths bring in to the mountains for, for their own benefit, to make sure they make it through their life cycle. But of course, all the creatures of the mountains have realized that these delicious moths arrive in summer. And so pygmy possums and the bent-winged bats and other critically endangered species, and then non-endangered species like ravens and skinks and all, you name it, they're all very aware of when these delicious little peanuts are arriving on the top of Mount Cosi. All right. Thanks for your questions. Wonderful. I'm now going to move on to the final part of the talk. So I wanted to tell you how Invertebrates Australia is helping protect bugs, and this might help you get some ideas for what you might put in your Species Conservation Challenge submission. So one of the things we're trying to do at Invertebrates Australia is figure out where the most important places are in Australia for invertebrates. Sounds like it might be quite easy, but there's a lot of gaps in our understanding about the different places that invertebrates exist, where our threatened species are, and how big an area our threatened species take up. So we need to look at the conservation status of more species. So we need to look at whether they meet the criteria for endangered, for example, or not. We also need to go out and have a look for these species. And there's a very exciting program coming up next week that we're partnering with the Invasive Species Council on, called Bugs in My Backyard. And if everyone can go out and find the bugs in their backyard, take photos of them and upload them to iNaturalist, we will get a much, much better understanding of where all of our invertebrates are. Invertebrates Australia's job is also to encourage citizen scientists to go into their backyards and do that. That's exactly what Bugs in My Backyard is all about. And to provide professional scientific advice on how to manage and conserve invertebrates and how to restore land in order to make sure our invertebrates are looked after. So, like I said, things that you can do: go out and have a look and see what critters you've got. You know, everyone's got invertebrates in their backyards, and it's super cool. Then some of them, even if they're quite familiar, are still amazing. Even if you find just a little humble garden snail, you might be surprised to find out that that little garden snail has all kinds of amazing things going on inside its body. It's the way its shell coils and all of the different organs that it has. And they're both boys and girls at the same time. And they have terrible vision, but they can taste with their feet and all kinds of wonderful things. So there's lots of questions that you can come up with if you're curious about what's in your backyard. You can also make sure that you've got a nice messy backyard that don't use pesticides and have native plants where you can and all that sort of thing. You can get involved in this Species Conservation Challenge by Aludo, and also you can become a supporter of Invertebrates Australia, sign up to our newsletter and join our bug walks and our webinars and all of that sort of thing, so you can get connected with everybody at IA. Thanks for listening, everybody. It's been wonderful to talk to you all and answer your questions, and I really appreciate all the engagement. And yeah, I'd just like to say thanks for listening. Get involved in your inverts. Go outside, check out what you've got at school, at home, as you're walking home, when you're waiting for the bus, and get curious about your little creatures. Thanks, everybody. Lovely to see you all, and happy bug hunting.